The morning sun bled through the cracks in the wooden walls, like threads of gold, fighting to survive the dust. The old cabin smelled of coffee gone cold and earth baked dry. Outside, the wind dragged its feet across the prairie, whispering through the brittle grass that bent under its touch. Inside, silence sat between two people who once thought the world began and ended at this very table. Hank Dalton leaned over the scarred wood, his hat-brimmed shadowing eyes the color of storm clouds. Across from him sat Clara, her apron still dusted with flour, hands clasped tight, as if holding on to something that might slip away. If she dared breathe wrong, between them lay a folded letter. Its edges were creased, the paper thin from being read and reread, as though repetition could change the words printed there. "You sure about this?" Hank's voice broke the stillness, rough and low, like boots dragging through gravel. Clara didn't look up. Her gaze stayed fixed on the letter, as if she could will the ink to fade. "It don't matter if I'm sure or not," she said. "It's what it is." Hank exhaled through his nose, a sound more like defeat than breath. "Ain't right, Clara? Your PA built this land with his own hands. No bankman's got the right to take it." She gave a soft, bitter laugh. PA also built it on loans he never finished paying. He rubbed the back of his neck, staring at the light spilling through the window and dancing across the tabletop. "I told ya, I'll find a way. There's work north of Abilene. Mason wrote me, says they're driven a herd through the pass come spring. Good pay. Maybe enough to cover what we owe. Maybe?" Her eyes finally lifted, tired and sharp, all at once. "But maybe it'll just be another job that gets you killed." That hit him harder than a bullet might have. Hank had spent years chasing jobs that promised salvation, but delivered bruises and broken bones instead. He'd been a ranch hand, a drifter, a man too proud to call himself beaten. Each time he swore it'd be the last. Each time he found himself back in the saddle, chasing one more hope across the desert. "I can't sit here and watch this place rot, Clara," he said quietly. "If I stay, the ranch dies. If I ride out, maybe we got a chance." She shook her head. "A chance ain't the same as a promise." The light through the window dimmed as a cloud rolled over the sun. It cast them both in the same dull shade of gray. Two silhouettes trapped by circumstance. "I ain't asking for forgiveness," Hank said. "Just a little faith." Her eyes softened. "Just a little. Faith don't feed horses, Hank. It don't buy seed or fix fences." He took off his hat and placed it on the table, revealing a brow lined deeper than his years. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered. "Every time I see this place, every dry trough, every empty stall, it eats me up. I can't let it go, Clara. Not this land, not what your PA started." Clara stared past him, through the small square window that framed the endless plain outside. The horizon shimmered in the distance, blurred by heat and longing. "He used to say, 'The land don't belong to us,'" she murmured. "Said it just borrows us for a while. Maybe it's time to let it borrow someone else." Hank's jaw tightened. "That ain't your PA, that's the bank TA can." She sighed, reaching out for the letter. Her fingers hesitated just before touching it, as though it might burn her. "The bank says we got 30 days. After that, they'll auction the place. Everything. The barn, the fields, even the old mare." He swallowed hard. 30 days is enough. I'll head north tomorrow." Clara's hands trembled slightly. "And if you don't come back, then I'll die trying to make it right." Silence again. Only the faint ticking of the old wall clock filled the air, counting moments that neither of them could stop. She rose from her chair, moving to the stove where a kettle had gone cold hours ago. She poured the coffee anyway, the bitter scent filling the air. Setting his cup down, she said softly, "I wish you'd stop thinking you gotta fix everything alone." He looked up at her, that same stubborn, beautiful woman he'd met at a barn dance 6 years ago. Back then, she'd laughed like nothing in the world could touch her. Now her laugh was gone, buried under Bill's drought. and too many broken mornings. Clara, he said, his voice breaking, if I stay, this place goes under. But if I go, you might not come back. She finished for him. He nodded. She took a long sip of her coffee, eyes never leaving his. Then, I suppose the question is, what hurts worse, losing the land, or losing you? The wind moaned outside like it had an answer neither of them wanted to hear. Hank stood up slowly, the floor creaking under his boots. He walked to the small cabinet by the wall and pulled out a worn leather satchel. I'll take Dusty and head out before dawn, he said. Trail north'll be rough, but I'll make do. Clara's voice was a whisper. And if you don't? He smiled faintly, that tired, crooked smile that always tried to hide his fear. Then at least you'll know I didn't quit. When she spoke again, her words were softer than the dust floating between them. I don't care about quitting, Hank. I care about you coming home. He wanted to promise her he would, but promises in the West were cheap and often buried beneath the same soil they were made on. So instead, he stepped close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. I'll do everything I can, he said. Clara reached out, her hand trembling as she brushed the edge of his sleeve. Then at least take this. She pressed a small silver locket into his palm, her mother's, the only piece of real jewelry left in the house. Inside was a faded picture of Clara as a girl, her hair in braids, her smile wide and hopeful. He looked at it for a long moment before nodding. I'll keep it close. That night, neither of them slept. Hank packed what little he needed, a rifle, some dried jerky, his knife, and a canteen. Outside, the coyotes sang under a half-moon, their cries echoing across the plains like ghosts calling each other home. Clara sat by the window, lamp burning low, watching him through the glass. The shadows stretched long across the floor, merging into one man and woman, love and loss, all tangled in the same flickering light. Just before dawn, Hank saddled Dusty. The horse snorted softly, sensing the weight of his master's resolve. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the shape of her face in the pale morning glow. I'll be back before you know it, he said. She forced a small smile. You never were good at keeping time, Hank Dalton. He touched the brim of his hat in a silent farewell, then turned his horse toward the open land. As he rode away, the rising sun caught his shadow, stretching it long and thin until it disappeared into the dust. Clara stood there long after he was gone. The wind tugged at her shawl, carrying away the faint echo of hoofbeats. When she finally turned back inside, the table still held the empty coffee cup, the folded letter, and a patch of sunlight just big enough for hope to rest in. She picked up the letter again, staring at the ink until it blurred. Then she whispered to the quiet room, You better come back, Hank Dalton, or this land'll never forgive either of us. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, a lonely, endless sound that carried both promise and sorrow in its breath, and sorrow in its breath. The road north was a ribbon of dust winding through a world that had forgotten kindness. Hank Dalton rode with the sun at his back, hat pulled low. His eyes narrowed against the glare of a sky so wide it seemed it could swallow a man whole. Dusty's hooves beat a steady rhythm into the earth, the sound of survival and distance dot behind him. The ranch Clara grew smaller until it was just a speck in the rear view of his mind. He'd promised her he'd come back, and in that promise lived both his hope and his curse. The trail stretched through country no one cared to claim. Dry riverbeds, canyons carved by angry wind, the bones of cattle bleached white under the sun. Some nights, coyotes sang. Some nights, the silence sang louder. Hank counted both as company. By the fourth day, he reached the trading post at Red Mesa, a lonely spot of wood and whiskey, surrounded by miles of nothing, the kind of place where men didn't ask names or tell truths. Inside, the air smelled of sweat, smoke, and cards gone bad. Hank ordered coffee, black, burnt, and bitter. and sat alone in the corner. He'd ridden far enough to feel the ache in his bones, but not far enough to find what he came for. A man with a scar down his cheek slid into the seat across from him. His coat was too clean for the dust, and his grin too sharp for honesty. "You Hank Dalton?" the stranger asked, his voice lazy but laced with danger. Hank didn't answer right away. "Who's Eskin?" "Name's Mason. You been looking for work?" "I got some." "Mason." The same name from the letter, Clara's last thread of hope. Hank straightened slowly. "Heard you were driven cattle north." Mason chuckled, tapping the edge of his hat. "That's one way to put it. Pays double what any honest herd would. Quick job, quick pay. You in?" Something in Hank's gut twisted. Men who used words like quick and double usually came with trouble strapped to their boots. But trouble was a luxury a desperate man couldn't afford to fear. He nodded once. "I'm in." Mason's smile widened like a snake, ready to strike. "Good. We ride at dawn." By sunrise, Hank found himself in the company of men who didn't talk much and laughed too loud when they did. Mason led the pack, 5 riders, a dozen cattle, and a silence thick enough to choke on. They moved north, cutting across plains marked with old fence lines and half-buried skulls. Hank rode behind, watching, thinking, measuring. Something about the herd didn't sit right. Too small for a drive that long, too restless. That night, when the moon rose pale over the ridge, he found Mason near the fire, counting money by its glow. "Where'd these cattle come from?" Hank asked quietly. Mason's grin flickered. "From a man who didn't need M anymore." "Did he say that? Or did you?" Mason's hand drifted toward his hip, just a whisper of movement. "You got a problem with where your pay comes from?" Hank met his eyes. "Only if it costs more than I can afford." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the kind of silence that had weight, the kind that could turn to violence with one wrong breath. Then Mason laughed, low and cold. "Relax, cowboy. You'll get your money. Just make sure you keep right in." But Hank couldn't relax. Not with the way those cattle spooked at shadows. Not with Mason's men whispering about McAllister's brand under the hide. He'd heard the name. The McAllisters ran half the territory. Men didn't steal from them unless they had a death wish. By the third night, Hank's suspicions turned to truth. From the ridge above their camp, lanterns flickered in the dark, riders closing in slow. "Mason," he called out. "We got company." The outlaw smirked. "Guess the McAllisters finally caught up. What now?" "Now we run." Gunfire shattered the night. Hank dove behind a wagon, bullets snapping through canvas. Dusty neighed, terrified. Mason's men scattered, some shooting back, others dying before they could draw. The air turned to thunder, gunfire hooves, shouting. The chaos of men fighting to stay alive. Hank fired twice, hitting shadows, then felt the burn of lead tear through his arm. He dropped to his knees, teeth gritted, blood soaking his sleeve. "Mason," he shouted. But Mason was gone, already riding off into the dark, leaving the rest to burn. Hank crawled toward Dusty, vision blurring. He managed to swing himself into the saddle, holding the reins with his good hand. Behind him, the camp was fire and fury. Ahead, only darkness. He rode hard until the stars blurred overhead, until the blood loss turned the world soft and gray. He woke to the sound of wind howling through the timbers of an abandoned way station. His arm was wrapped in a rag torn from his shirt. The bleeding slowed, but not stopped. The air smelled of dust and iron, the scent of survival. He lay there a long time, listening to the hollow, quiet. Every breath felt borrowed, every thought heavy. Finally, he reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of paper, the corners stained with blood. He began to write. "Clara, if I don't make it back, know that I tried. I did this for the ranch, for you, for the promise we made by that old table. The world out here don't care much for promises, but I do. If this letter finds you, don't cry none. Just remember I kept my word, far as I could." Hanky paused, staring at the unfinished line. His hand trembled, the ink smudged by sweat and pain. Then he folded the letter and tucked it inside his vest, next to the silver locket Clara had given him. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not like this." The next morning, the sun rose over a world that didn't notice he'd almost died. Hank saddled Dusty with shaking hands and turned south, toward home. He had no herd, no pay, no Mason, just the wound, the letter, and the ghost of a promise. The ride back was slow, cruel, endless. He passed through ghost towns, wells dry, doors swinging on one hinge, the smell of lost dreams thick in the air. Every mile tested him. Hunger clawed, fever burned. But the thought of Clara kept him upright in the saddle. Her voice, her hands, her faith, even when it cracked. On the 7th night, he saw a storm brewing far off. Lightning licked the sky, and thunder rolled like the voice of God himself. Hank rode straight into it, the rain washing blood and dust from his skin. It hurt like salvation. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed. The world felt clean again, even if he didn't single quotes. He stopped by the edge of a bluff overlooking the valley. Far beyond the horizon, he could almost imagine the Dalton ranch, small, stubborn, still standing. He took out the letter one last time, reading his own words in the pale light. Then he tore it in half. "I ain't done yet," he said to the wind. Dusty snorted, as if agreeing. Hank smiled through the pain, turned his horse toward the south, and started the long ride home. Behind him, the plains stretched endless and empty. Ahead, the promise of Clara and the dust that had yet to settle. The rain had stopped 2 days ago, but the land still smelled of it, that rare, clean scent that felt almost holy after months of dust. By the time Hank Dalton saw the roofline of the ranch rising out of the horizon, the sun was already low, bleeding its last light across the plains. Every muscle in his body screamed, every breath burned, but he kept riding, one slow, steady step at a time. Dusty limped, her sides heaving. The poor mare had carried more than her share of burden, hunger, storms, bullets, and hope. Hank leaned forward, whispering to her through cracked lips, "Just a little more, girl. We're almost home. Home." The word felt foreign in his mouth. When he finally reached the fence line, he stopped and just stared. The ranch looked smaller somehow, fences broken, barn roof half-caved, fields gone to weeds. Yet the chimney smoked faintly, a thin gray ribbon twisting up into the evening sky. She was still there. He slid from the saddle, boots sinking into the wet earth, and tied Dusty by the old post. The horse lowered her head and sighed, grateful to rest. Hank straightened his hat, though it was more dirt than felt now, and walked toward the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last. His arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, the wound now a jagged scar under the bandage. He thought of all the things he should say, all the lies he could tell, and knew none of them would matter. When he reached the door, it opened before he could knock. Clara stood there, framed in the light of the hearth, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide with disbelief and something deeper, fear, relief, love all tangled together for a heartbeat. Neither of them moved. Then she whispered, "Hank." He managed a crooked smile. "You were expecting someone else." She covered her mouth with both hands, a sound escaping half sob, half laughter. Then she ran forward and caught him before he could fall. He hadn't realized until that moment how weak he truly was. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee. She guided him to the chair by the fire, her hands trembling as she touched the blood-stained edge of his coat. "You're hurt," she said, voice shaking. "I've been worse." She didn't answer, just fetched a basin of water and began cleaning the wound. Her touch was gentle, but firm, like a prayer she refused to rush. When she finally looked up, her eyes glistened in the firelight. "You promised you'd come back." He winced as she pressed a cloth to the wound. "I did. "You damn fool," she whispered. "You almost didn't." Hank chuckled softly, though it turned into a cough halfway through. "Wouldn't be the first time I bit off more than I could chew." Clara shook her head, tears spilling down. "You don't have to be the hero, Hank." He caught her wrist, stopping her hand. "I ain't no hero, Clara. I just couldn't stand losing you. For a long time." The only sound was the fire snapping in the hearth and the wind brushing against the window. Then Hank reached inside his vest and pulled out a small leather pouch. He set it on the table between them. It clinked when it hit the wood, the unmistakable sound of coins. Clara frowned. "What's that?" "Enough," he said quietly. "Enough to pay the bank and keep this land ours." She looked at him, disbelief flickering into suspicion. "Where did you get it?" He stared into the fire. "Worked a job up north. Dangerous, but it paid." She didn't push, but she knew there was more to the story. She could see it in his eyes, the ghosts hiding behind the flame. After a while, she said softly, "Mason." He nodded once. "He's gone." She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. Out here, a man didn't return from a job like that without leaving something or someone behind. Clara reached across the table, taking his hand. "You came back. That's what matters." He squeezed her fingers gently. "For a while, I didn't think I'd make it, but every time I thought about giving up, I saw you sitting right here, this table, this light. It pulled me through." Tears slid down her cheek. "You stubborn, beautiful fool." He smiled faintly. "Guess it takes one to love one." That night, Hank slept for the first time in weeks. Real sleep, deep and dreamless. When he woke, morning light was spilling through the curtains, soft and gold. He heard Clara in the kitchen, humming a tune he hadn't heard since before the drought. He sat up slowly, his body aching but alive. The sound of her voice filled the room, a sound that made the place feel like home again. When she noticed he was awake, she smiled. "Coffee's on the stove. You take it black, same as always?" He grinned. "Ain't broke yet. No reason to fix it." They ate together in silence. Fresh bread, leftover stew, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Outside, sunlight glinted off the puddles left by the rain. The land looked cleaner, greener even. Hope, fragile and small, had begun to sprout again. After breakfast, Hank stepped outside to check the fence. His arm ached, but he ignored it. The earth was damp beneath his boots, and the air carried the promise of more rain. He hadn't seen the land look this alive in years. From the porch, Clara called out, "You think the ranch can make it?" He turned, smiling. "Reckon it can, if we give it the same fight we gave each other." She laughed, the sound carrying across the yard like a blessing. A week later, the bankman came, polished boots, pressed coat, smile like a razor. He dismounted slow, eyeing the place as though already counting what he'd sell. "Mrs. Dalton," he said politely, "I trust you received our final notice." Clara stepped out onto the porch, head high, the small leather pouch in her hand. "Reckon we won't be needing any more of those." He opened the pouch, eyebrows rising slightly at the weight of gold inside. "Well, I'll be. Looks like you found yourselves a miracle." Hank stood behind her, silent, one hand resting on the doorframe. The banker tipped his hat and left without another word, his horse kicking up dust as he rode away. When he disappeared over the hill, Clara turned to Hank. "You did it." He nodded, watching the horizon. "We did it." But even as he said it, he felt the ache of everything it had cost. The men who wouldn't ride again. The blood that still clung to his hands, no matter how hard the rain had fallen. Clara stepped close, laying her head against his chest. "It's over now," she murmured. "Let it be over." He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin atop her hair. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe the dust's finally settling." That evening, as the sun dipped low, they sat together on the porch. The sky blazed orange and violet. The kind of sunset you only saw after a storm had passed. Clara leaned against him, fingers laced with his. You ever think about leaving this place? Hank chuckled. Every damn day. Then why stay? He looked out over the land, the fences, the barn, the stretch of earth that had nearly broken them both. Because it's ours, he said, and maybe that's enough. She smiled, eyes soft. Maybe it is. They sat there until the light faded, until the stars came out and the world turned quiet. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt peaceful, not empty, inside. The old table still stood where it always had, the same table that had held a letter, a promise, and a piece of their hearts. Now it held only the soft glow of a lantern and 2 cups of coffee, cooling side by side. Hank took one last look at the sky, then turned to Clara. Tomorrow, he said, we start reaping. She nodded. Tomorrow. The night settled around them like a blanket. Somewhere out on the plain, a coyote called. A lonely sound, but no longer a sad one. Hank took her hand again and smiled, small and sure. Feels like the world's starting over. Clara squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it finally is. And as the wind swept softly through the grass, the dust, the same dust that had hung between them for so long, began at last to settle.